Imagine living in a quiet neighborhood, thinking your biggest worry is a missed garbage pickup. Then, one day, your HOA decides to take away your rights. Literally. I'm talking about banning you from owning guns just because of a rule they pulled out of nowhere. But what happens when a simple homeowner, with everything on the line, takes a stand against a system that's out to crush them? The battle becomes something far bigger than property lines and petty politics. This is a fight for freedom, for your rights, and a moment that'll leave you questioning just how far these neighborhood tyrants will go. How far would you go to strike back? Stay tuned. Mark had always considered himself a quiet, law-abiding citizen. He didn't seek attention, and he certainly didn't crave drama. He and his wife, Laura, had moved into the small, gated community of Evergreen Estates 5 years ago, drawn by the charm of tree-lined streets and the promise of a safe, family-oriented environment. Their 2 kids, Emma and Jack, loved riding their bikes down the sidewalks, waving at neighbors who shared warm hellos over white picket fences. Everything seemed perfect until it wasn't. Mark worked a steady 9-to-5 job as a software developer, spending long hours in front of his computer, creating solutions for companies that needed them. Laura, ever the meticulous homemaker, took pride in keeping their modest house looking pristine. The house itself wasn't much, a 3-bedroom ranch with a cozy backyard and a few shrubs lining the front yard. But it was theirs, and that sense of ownership had always meant something. It was their little piece of the world. But beneath the calm facade of this picture-perfect suburban life, there were rules. So many rules. Evergreen Estates, like most HOAs, had a laundry list of regulations that promised to keep the neighborhood clean and orderly. From rules about grass length to the placement of trash bins, there was always something to keep up with. But Mark didn't mind. He respected the rules, as most of his neighbors did, because it was easy to comply when the boundaries were clear and reasonable. It wasn't until he decided to make a few improvements to his property that things started to shift. Nothing major, just a few renovations to enhance the curb appeal. He replaced an old fence, added some landscaping, and put in a small garden at the front. Nothing that would stand out too much, just subtle upgrades to make the home feel more inviting. But then one day, Mark received a letter from the HOA. It was a formal notification, a warning. At first, he thought it was just the usual maintenance reminder, or perhaps a friendly nudge about a neighbor's complaint. But when he opened the letter, it took him a moment to process what he was reading. The HOA was taking issue with his new fence. Apparently, it was the wrong height, a violation of a rule he didn't even know existed. A rule buried deep in the community's guidelines. But that wasn't the worst part. The letter also mentioned that his modifications had altered the approved aesthetic of the neighborhood, and that Mark was in direct violation of several other unspoken rules. It was a small infraction, but one that seemed to carry a surprising amount of weight. Mark was stunned. He'd always done his best to be a good neighbor. He'd been part of the community meetings, paid his dues on time, and maintained his property. Yet here he was, caught in a web of invisible regulations. His peaceful suburban life was starting to feel anything but peaceful. As he sat at his kitchen table, staring at the letter, his mind raced. Could it really be this simple? Could one small change to his property spark such a reaction? And if so, how far were these HOA enforcers willing to go? Mark had heard stories of neighbors fighting back over similar issues, but he'd always dismissed them as exaggerations. Now it seemed like his turn was coming. But this was just the beginning. Mark didn't know it yet, but the real issue was not just the fence. It was the sudden, unexpected targeting of his rights. A small, seemingly innocent violation that would soon spiral into a fight he wasn't prepared for. He stood up, folded the letter, and shoved it into his pocket. It was time to attend the next HOA meeting. What had started as a simple, innocent change to his home was about to pull him into something much darker. And that's when the first red flag appeared. A new rule, one that made Mark's heart skip a beat. It wasn't about fences anymore. It was about something far more personal. The next few weeks felt like a blur. Mark's calm, predictable life was rapidly becoming a whirlwind of endless paperwork, harassing letters, and anxiety-ridden nights. The first HOA warning had been shocking enough, but now it was as if they were waiting for him to slip up, searching for any small mistake to punish him. After the fence debacle, Mark thought he had done his part by attending the HOA meeting. He showed up with a stack of documents in hand, ready to argue his case. The meeting room was dimly lit, filled with the soft murmur of other homeowners waiting to speak. He noticed that the usual crowd of faces seemed different this time, tense, impatient, even a little hostile. He was no longer just one of the good neighbors. He had become the subject of their scorn. As the meeting began, the board president, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia, who seemed to always have a sneer tucked under her professional smile, called the meeting to order. Her tone was civil, but Mark could feel the weight of her eyes on him as she scanned the room. When it was his turn, he stood up, ready to explain. "I'm here to address the issues with my property modifications," he began, trying to sound calm, but his voice faltered slightly as the room fell silent. "The concern isn't the upgrades, Mark," Patricia continued. "It's the unapproved changes that don't adhere to the neighborhood's aesthetic guidelines. These rules aren't suggestions, they're mandatory." A few homeowners in the crowd nodded, some even murmuring under their breath in agreement. Mark swallowed hard. It was clear this wasn't going to be an easy fight. "The height of the fence," Patricia continued, "is one of several violations. And frankly, if everyone started ignoring the rules as you have, this community would turn into a circus." Mark gritted his teeth. "The fence is barely noticeable, Patricia, and the rest of my property is kept in line with the rules. It's not like I've turned my yard into a junkyard." Patricia didn't respond, but her gaze cut through him like a blade. And just like that, the meeting continued. No resolution, no compromises. The homeowners on the board seemed more interested in maintaining their rigid order than acknowledging his valid points. The next day, another letter arrived. It wasn't just a warning this time. The HOA had fined him. The fine wasn't a small amount. It was $500. It seemed petty, and for a moment, Mark considered just paying it and moving on with his life. But something about it gnawed at him. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was about the principle of the matter, about them trying to control his life, his home, and his rights. He couldn't just sit back and let it go. That afternoon, Mark called a lawyer. He needed advice, something to stop the relentless harassment from the HOA. He had heard of homeowners fighting back before, but he never thought he would be the one caught in the crosshairs. The lawyer was a man named Ben. He was patient but firm. HOA boards are notorious for overreaching, and unfortunately, they often get away with it because most homeowners just give in. They don't know their rights. But you have options, Mark. You can fight back, but it's going to take more than just a letter or a phone call. If you want to stand your ground, you'll need to make some serious noise. That night, Mark stayed up late reading through laws and HOA regulations. As he scanned through legal documents and forums where other homeowners shared their stories, one thing became clear. His battle was just beginning, and it wasn't just about the fence anymore. The HOA was systematically targeting homeowners who they felt were rebelling against their rigid rules. Some of the stories were unbelievable. People fined for having a flag on their porch. Others who were told they couldn't park in their own driveways because their cars were too old. Mark wasn't alone, but in many ways, that only made it worse. A few days later, Mark and Laura received another surprise. A new letter from the HOA. This time, it wasn't just about the fence. This one was about his gun ownership. Mark had always been a responsible gun owner. He owned a couple of rifles for hunting and a few handguns for protection. He kept them locked up in a secure safe, following all state and local regulations. But now, out of nowhere, the HOA had decided that owning firearms wasn't in keeping with the family-friendly image they were trying to cultivate. The letter stated that he was banned from owning firearms while living in the neighborhood. The letter was cryptic but firm. For the safety of our community, it read, no firearms are allowed on the premises. The HOA demanded that Mark either remove his firearms from the property or face further action. Mark's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about minor violations anymore. This was personal. They were trying to strip him of his basic rights, rights that he never once imagined being questioned. Laura was just as furious as he was. She said, "They can't do this. This is unconstitutional." Mark paced the living room. He was used to rules. He'd followed them his whole life. But this was a new low. He thought about the other neighbors, the ones who had stayed silent, too scared to challenge the HOA. How many of them were living in fear? It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been intimidated into silence by an authority figure with too much power and not enough oversight. Over the following weeks, Mark's lawyer, Ben, worked tirelessly to ensure that the HOA's abuse of power would not go unchallenged. Ben filed a formal complaint with the State Housing Authority, citing multiple violations of Mark's civil rights. The local media continued to cover the story, and the growing public outcry put pressure on the HOA board to address their behavior or face a public relations nightmare that could destroy them. Meanwhile, Mark's legal team was building a case against the HOA for its illegal gun ban. The more they dug into the situation, the more they uncovered. It turned out that the HOA's firearm ban was completely outside their legal authority. They had no right to enforce such a rule. It was a violation of state and federal laws. Mark wasn't just fighting for his own rights anymore. He was fighting for the rights of every homeowner who had ever been subjected to these kinds of abuses. He wasn't just taking on the HOA. He was taking on the entire system of unchecked power that have allowed them to act with impunity. Then came the tipping point. The final public confrontation was set to take place in a larger-than-life HOA meeting. The board had called it in an attempt to address the community's concerns after the media circus had cast them in a harsh light. The meeting was being held in the community center, and Mark knew this was his chance to put the final nail in the HOA's coffin. He wasn't going to let them continue sweeping their misdeeds under the rug. On the day of the meeting, the room was packed with residents. Mark had never seen the community so full of energy. There were dozens of new faces, people who had never attended a meeting before, but who now wanted to speak up. They had seen the headlines, heard the whispers, and they were ready to make their voices heard. Mark's heart raced as he stood in the back of the room, knowing that the outcome of this meeting would be the culmination of everything he had fought for. Patricia stepped up to the podium, her expression grim as she looked over the room. Her eyes darted to Mark in the back, but she quickly turned away. The tension in the room was palpable. "We've called this meeting to address the ongoing concerns regarding the recent events. As many of you know, there have been allegations made against the board, and we feel it is important to clear the air and restore the integrity of this community." Mark could feel the anger rising in him, but he stayed calm. This wasn't about shouting. It was about exposing the truth. As Patricia droned on, talking in circles about the integrity of the community and the responsibilities of the board, Mark couldn't help but notice how out of touch she was with reality. The community was no longer behind her. The support she once had was crumbling, and she knew it. When the time came for residents to speak, the room erupted. One by one, people took the microphone and the stories started flowing. There were homeowners who had been fined for their gardens not being neat enough, for their cars being too old, for painting their houses a color that wasn't approved by the board. Every story added fuel to the fire. Mark stood up and made his way to the front, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and fear. As he approached the microphone, the room went silent. He took a deep breath, then began to speak. I'm here because I refuse to accept that this was the way it had to be. I'm here because I don't believe that a few people in an office should have the power to dictate our lives, to control our rights, to take away what belongs to us." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. The crowd was hanging on every word. The truth is, this isn't just about me. This is about all of us. This is about standing up to the people who think they can bully us, who think they can tell us how to live in our own homes. This is about taking back control of our lives and our rights. The room erupted in applause. People were standing up, clapping, cheering. Mark could feel the energy shift in the room. For the first time, it felt like the power was in the hands of the residents. Patricia's face went pale as the applause grew louder. She tried to speak, but the crowd drowned her out. The board members beside her were nervously glancing at each other, realizing that they had lost control of the situation. It was clear that the tide had turned. Mark's lawyer, Ben, was already preparing the paperwork for the lawsuit. They had gathered enough evidence, enough public support, and enough legal leverage to put the HOA in a position they couldn't ignore. Within days, the media began reporting on the HOA's abuses with even more fervor, and public pressure mounted. The HOA was forced to back down, and Patricia's resignation came just days later. The board's corrupt grip on the community was finally broken. Mark's victory wasn't just a personal one. It was a victory for every homeowner who had ever felt helpless in the face of an overbearing HOA. It was a victory for every person who had been bullied, fined, or threatened by the very people who were supposed to protect their rights. The community had come together, and the message was clear. They would no longer tolerate the abuse of power. In the aftermath, Evergreen Estates began to change. The rules, once rigid and oppressive, were revisited and amended. Homeowners had a voice in the decisions that affected their lives. The power had shifted back to the people who lived there. Mark and Laura stood together on their porch one evening, watching their kids play in the yard. Mark smiled, feeling the weight of everything lift off his shoulders. He had fought for something bigger than just a fence or a gun. He had fought for freedom, for fairness, for the right to live his life on his own terms. And as the sun set over Evergreen Estates, Mark knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning.